All right, let's go. All right, let's go.
All right, Joe, are you ready to get this show started, man?
Let's roll.
Let's do it. Well, last time we kind of talked like the release of our Invoice Hub Essentials tool. We kind of talked about a lot of the problems we see both on the carrier side and the shipper side, but we kept it pretty high level. Like we stayed up here, aggregate level information. So what I wanted to do today was see if we can just go down a few levels, right? And let's dig into certain factors within the cycle of all of that happens, the life cycle of a shipment that creates this. Even before like a quote is fully captured, there's problems that start. So like one of the things that I want to focus on, and I just got back from doing customer events, and one of the slides that we do in these customer events is we get right on to dispute data, right? And like one of the things that comes out of this is what is the acceptable threshold? And overwhelmingly, like over half of the population polled is like 0, dude. 0 is the threshold that I want. But that means the other half deal with these. And I think the whole populace deals with these. But when you deal with these and you don't agree, you have to dispute. And within that dispute is cycle time, back and forth information, and lots of time to task activities for both folks. So let's unpack dispute cycle time and like why shippers should care about this, or how should they look at it?
Yeah, look, it's a sticky topic. No one likes fights. No one likes to have to resolve issues that are discrepancies. No one likes to dispute things, especially if they don't have correct information. So what are we talking about when we talk about disputes, cycle times, and why shippers should care? So a dispute cycle time is the amount of time it takes to identify a discrepancy in your invoice and reach a final resolution between the carrier and the shipper, whether it's a credit, a rebill, an approval, or a payment release. So most shippers think about disputes as an accounting problem, and really it's an operational efficiency problem and metric. The longer the dispute stays open, more manual touch points, emails, phone calls, internal coordination, it's a headache, right? And if we think about LTL specifically, these disputes are an incredibly common problem, from fuel surcharge mismatches to reweighs, reclasses. I think we're all familiar with those. So the companies that really focus on reducing dispute cycle times usually see faster carrier payments, better carrier relationships, less labor costs down chasing paperwork and whatnot. And at the end of the day, improved cash flow visibility and fewer write-offs and missed recoveries.
I'm glad you said the cash flow piece, because I've been on the road for a little while. So I was like, oh, I'm going to ask Joe about this. Then I forgot about it and new information entered my brain. So let's get into that a little bit. The dispute cycle time is wild to me. And when you say balance sheets, right? Just because you're in dispute with something doesn't mean it ain't sitting on your books. It's like that money's in hold, right? Now it's on hold on the shipper side, and it's on hold on the carrier side as far as accounts payable to accounts receivable, right? So it's like those balance dues just sit there and kind of grow. And so you're not really getting away with anything. It's a hold pattern that nobody sees. And I think part of the problem too within that dispute cycle, Joe, is like, I think the shipper feels offended by getting that invoice that didn't match, right? But there's a ton of missing context on why it happened. They just see one line item, right? Reweigh, core rate change, or however the carrier displays it. But what I see is two common pathways, and I think you've got a good path to solve these. Is the first pathway I see is they'll just email their local account executive, right? And they will literally push this off on the carrier to go investigate, get context, and then explain back to the individual user or shipper about why this happened. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to agree with it. It just means you had to stop and go explore around and take time out of your day. So boom, you have lost time right there, right? Meanwhile, the shipper gets back, still doesn't agree with this, and now the dispute happens. They say formally file a dispute. And now this is where we have different pathways. Sometimes they stay email and they say, you take care of it, account executive. You go fill this out and file it. The other side of that is they have to log in, just like filing a claim, because that's what a dispute is really, right? It's no different than a freight claim. You're just saying, I don't agree with something, and I have to file that. And we've even seen what carriers have done. Some of them have said, I won't do emails anymore. It's either all or nothing. you have to put this into my portal. So why do you think they do that?
Yeah, look, to resolve a dispute, you need evidence, right? And when a shipper opens a dispute and says, hey, this item charge is incorrect, why? Or can you investigate this? That is not helpful for any party. Mm-hmm. And the biggest cause and issue of this is it extends the time to resolution. So there's a significant delay in unlocking this cash that's locked up in this dispute. And so at the end of the day, what I think is the biggest issue is its fragmentation. Mm-hmm. The invoice lives in one system, the quote lives somewhere else, supporting documents are buried in emails, and the communication with the carrier happens outside of the platform entirely in most cases, if you're not using, obviously, our system in MyCarrier. So a few specific cases where, missing backup documentation like a reweigh or weight inspection certificates are not present. Manual invoice audits done within spreadsheets, no standardized workflow between operations and AP, or in your case that you just mentioned, carrier reps are handling disputes through emails, and they're handling multiple disputes with multiple shippers. Delayed invoice ingestion from carriers also sort of includes this delay or increases this delay. And then, at the end of the day, no clear ownership internally from the shipper side of who's going to own the communication with that carrier to resolve this dispute. And all those things we hear constantly where, shipper A says, hey, we know there's an issue, but gathering the proof takes longer to resolve the actual charge, or it's not worth my time. And they put the onus on the carrier, and that's just not helpful for either party.
Yeah. So basically it's like you just really unpacked the like biggest causes or delays within the dispute process. And what's crazy is from a carrier's perspective, I picked this freight up when you asked me to. I delivered it, clear, damaged, happy to the customer. I fulfilled my end of the bargain, but I also found some evidence where it wasn't what you said it was. So thus the invoice changes, dispute is rendered. Right. And now the whole problem starts this is where the breakdown is.
Yeah, for sure. And look, it's about visibility. Most companies don't actually have a centralized system where the LTL transaction is quoted, booked, dispatched, invoiced, and paid. Mm-hmm. If all of those pieces of information existed in the same system on the same screen, and both the shipper and carrier parties could be privy to that information, this stuff would happen a lot more quickly. So I think it's about visibility, and the process immediately fails when it gets sent via email and it starts to operate, and that contextual knowledge starts to be gathered outside of the system. So you need a centralized place to see what's disputed, who owns it, what's the documentation that exists, how long has it been open, and whether the carrier has responded to it or not. I think another breakdown is the handoff between operations and accounting, right? As I mentioned, this is an operational issue. Operation teams need to understand that this is in the shipment details, and they're the first line of defense of understanding, audit this invoice, and before it goes to AP, understand whether it's approved or it needs to be disputed.
Yeah. So the funny thing is you kind of mentioned evidence, right? Which is what the carrier needs, which is why they kind of force them through that portal aspect to put them through more of a fact-based thing. Because I think when you get these, there's an emotional attachment to getting an invoice that doesn't match, right? And what that really
like they're offended. They're personally offended.
Yeah. So now that erodes trust. And once you have trust erosion, you have a problem. And simply because they didn't have a good process up front, it creates this. And I see this all the time. A lot of this is self-induced by an LTL carrier by the different choose your adventure stories or pathways we give the shippers to communicate with us. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. And I'll unpack it from the carrier side, and then you unpack it from what we're doing here. Kind of solve that. But if you look at any one carrier website, and it's not to call out anybody, I'll call out the whole community on this one. I could go in there and just get a quick rate quote, and then I'm cool. I picked you as a carrier, but you have very limited information. That was zip, not even full address. And then I could go back in there and say, I've chosen you as a carrier, but instead of completing a linear workflow, I just go in there and I submit a pickup request. I create my own bill of lading that has that captured information on it. But now I've missed complete address for quoting. I likely didn't have dimensions when I quoted it. So now I'm missing key pieces of information, right? And this is where this all falls apart, in my opinion. I always tell people all the time, chicken or the egg, but do we have a quoting problem or an invoicing problem? Well, you can't have an invoicing problem without a quoting problem. So that's where I think this all really starts. So let's unpack what we're doing here and how you're taking it from cradle to grave through the whole workflow to really solve this issue for the shippers, right? Which is something I think we do pretty slick and easy.
Right. So what our system does out of the gate, after a shipment is delivered and an invoice is issued, we're able to take the total amount due that was initiated on the quote, put it side by side the invoice, and automatically calculate if there's a penny difference. And the shipper can say, if this invoice is 5 cents off a quote, I want an alert. And that's how we get accurate automated auditing out of the gate. Now, let's assume that there is a discrepancy, and let's assume that that threshold is outside the shipper's tolerance. Let's call it $10, which is a very low tolerance, but we'll call it $10. Because LTL shippers usually work with, on average, 2 to 3 different carriers a month, carriers need to understand that just because their internal process to resolve a dispute is one way, the shipper is going to have a hard time adhering to that in every single case. The benefit of using MyCarrier to resolve disputes, especially these invoice inconsistencies or overcharges, is we actually understand what type of documentation a carrier needs depending on the dispute type. And that is a very key piece here, because depending on if you have a reweigh or reclass versus a liftgate charge or residential delivery accessorial, we understand by carrier what each organization is going to require to understand what is going to be disputed and how do we resolve it as quickly as possible. And that doesn't necessarily live in an email inbox. It lives against your shipment details, and it lives next to your invoice documents.
Now, I absolutely love everything you just covered there. And another call out I want to make here is that before, like you covered from dispatch beyond, I want to just let the shippers know that, like that example I gave in the carrier website, right? One of the things that I think we've done really well is a very linear flow through the information gathering process to put you through a defined workflow. If you give me full address when you enter the quote record, I will help you validate site delivery unknown accessorials, right? You type in a high school you're going to deliver to. It's summertime. Everybody's redoing high schools. Government money's going out. They're updating those things. You've got deliveries going in there. Well, guess what? The shipper doesn't know that because I went to a school, it's limited access. They don't know that they may need an appointment, that they may need a lift gate. So we're helping get that information up front that they otherwise wouldn't know. And then we do require dimensions. And you know what I found is most shippers are pretty freaking accurate, even with just using their tape measure, right? And so we're able to pass that through. And I think through this workflow, that information gets collected up front. Doesn't solve all of these problems, but I think what we've done is created a better pathway forward. And then when it does hit an issue, what you explained was giving them a way to manage those issues. So let's talk about how these shippers are managing them today. You've been on several calls with our shippers. And at these customer events, I always tease out, I'm like, everybody has it, and I get a laugh over it when I tell them they all have a spreadsheet that's like a biological organism because it's growing, it's adding columns of data, multiple contributors. I might even see that Joe's in there right now adding notes to something, right? Yeah. But that's hard to parse. It's hard to synthesize. And I'm a big believer, if you don't have all the facts in front of you and the data, it's hard to go solve that problem because then you're operating on recency bias and feelings. And you need to remove that. So tell me about some of the data that we collect and how you could leverage that as a shipper to like have better communication, have better relationships, right? And solve problems.
Yeah, for sure. I think it goes back to the two initial points of pre-MyCarrier. Fragmentation and visibility are the biggest issues with shippers. And look, shippers, whether you're an expert in manufacturing widgets or solar panels or rock walls displays, pool equipment, heavy machinery, you're not an expert at LTL quoting, dispatching, and invoicing, right? And so the carriers actually do need to provide some level of standardization for the shipping community. But using MyCarrier as a central data repository, that being the quote, the shipment, the invoice, and supporting documents, we're going to put guardrails in place for that LTL shipper so that they understand what the correct workflow is. So whether you mentioned upfront on an accessorial or an address validation, on the back end, an accessorial validation, we're going to be able to break out those line item charges on the invoice and put it right next to the quote details for that shipper. So they're not going to have to chase paperwork. They're not going to have to chase the bill of lading, the weight and inspection certificate, the delivery, proof of delivery, and all of this documentation. We're going to all package it in a nice, neat bow, digitize it, and put it right on your screen. Yeah. And I think that that's the biggest difference between custom companies who can resolve disputes quickly and that those that don't. Yeah. What I like to see, or what I see, is that three primary things, and they use MyCarrier, is these companies are fastest to resolve disputes quickly, is they have centralized data, they have standardized ownership of those disputes, and they automate the exception detection of that invoice to quote reconciliation.
Now I love that, because one of the things that I think is really cool with the way that we've tackled this problem is there's not just one owner, and you kind of mentioned that. There's cross-departmental stuff here. So and we've seen different scenarios. Sometimes accounting receives everything, right? And whatever matches, they deal with. Whatever doesn't, for whatever threshold they do, they kick it down. Now, another one I've seen is where it's really decoupled and shipping books everything, and accounting just pays everything because they don't have that record there. So what would you tell shippers who may be unaware of this problem because there's certain departments that are decoupled, they're disjointed, information doesn't share fast enough? Like somebody who doesn't use MyCarrier, how could they start to look at this to go, oh, okay, I think we have a problem here and I want to tie this out. And then what should they do to put a solution in place?
Yeah. So I want to be very clear and repeat something that I said. So centralized data, standardized ownership, not necessarily centralized ownership, right?
Yes.
Because as you mentioned, these organizations are quite diverse. You might have the shipping and logistics operation department, and you might have the accounting department. We recognize that those are two disparate workflows, two disparate departments. They roll up to different hierarchies. So we don't necessarily expect them to centralize ownership of this invoicing a payables issue as well as an operational dispute issue. Because everyone knows the centralization or the standardization of that ownership is that everyone knows who's in charge of opening the dispute. Everyone knows who's in charge of approving the payment. And you communicate with the carriers, you communicate inside maybe your spreadsheet and understand what are the internal service level agreements that you're going to standardize and roll that out with your vendors. And I think that that's, whether you use MyCarrier or not, those organizations that are on top of it, and it could be another ERP or system, but those kind of three or four things is there's clear ownership of who's managing the dispute. There's clear ownership of who approves payment, communicates with carriers, and then obviously these internal service level agreements of timing.
Yeah. Now, I do think that, well, if you don't want to use MyCarrier, and there's other tools out there in the marketplace, but let's say you're not using anything at all today, there's definitely stuff you can do to start evaluating this. And I love that you uncovered all of that, because there's people out there today that think that this is just part of LTL, right? That, this is just the nature of the beast in the business. They almost have a defeatist attitude about this. But after what you've gone through, there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel. And I think with where we're able to take invoice ingestion, right? Because if you can't ingest the invoices in a proper manner, and we can talk about that, you're going to have problems. And I know those are challenges we've had too, but the way these shippers are ingesting them today are email. And it makes it hard to do what you just described.
Yep. Yeah. Whether it's an EDI connection to create an invoice record, or as we're doing today, whether it's a document that we use artificial intelligence to extract that invoice data and digitize an invoice record, we're able to take this amount of data and feed it back into workflows like disputes, eventually like claims. But that connects that data back to the shipment record. And then you're able to see these discrepancies very clearly and organize, almost like your spreadsheet that you're managing in Microsoft, right? When you open up MyCarrier and you look at an invoice and it's connected to the shipment, it matches line by line down to the cent. And if it's not, then you're able to gather those documentations. You're able to see per carrier which carrier needs what type of documentation based on the dispute. And then you're able to start figuring that out from there.
Yeah.
The visibility when managing those invoices disputes is also another thing. Who's going to open them? What's the carrier response time? How do you get to the root cause of the issue? And then obviously you have this sort of cash flow issue of your aging, your AP is aging, the recurring overcharges. This visibility turns disputes from like a reactive firefighting into like an operational intelligence. We're able to manage exactly what's happening in these times. We're able to intelligently show which documents are required so that everything is just faster.
Yeah. And one thing I see all the time, and this is just a message to the shippers out there, right? And I've been one. We grade the carriers, right? We grade them on their performance. We're pretty hard on them from a shipper standpoint. I want you guys to know out there that the carriers also grade the quality of the payload of information or data you deliver to them, how you deliver it to them, and how hard they have to work to do business with you. And all as that does is increase their costs, right? Because what you've really done is outsourced your problem to them in some regards. Now let's talk, Joe, on the carrier side. There's still a lot of efficiencies to be gained. Because of all the problems we talked about on the shipper side of the fence, I could only imagine that what the carrier is experiencing is at scale times 1,000 what the shipper is. So let's kind of unpack some of that, right? Because most of these guys have 15 to 30-day terms, but that ain't necessarily when they get paid.
Right, exactly. Look, and the fact that some carriers implement a portal to centralize disputes is a byproduct of having to manage and the increased overhead and, let's be honest, reduced profile margin of that SMB shipper. And if that SMB shipper's cost to service is going to be higher than what they make on each load, you're not going to get the good service. You're not going to get great rates when it comes time for renewal or contractual rate changes. You're going to be out of step from that carrier. So carriers want to work with shippers who are efficient, who understand the process, and obviously the MyCarrier Invoice Hub and disputes help manage that for carriers. And I think that once they are able to, and I would say that the Invoice Hub and disputes really supplement, if not completely replace, a carrier dispute portal, is because we have the intelligence across the whole LTL market. We don't have the profiling of a certain shipper base or a certain carrier customer base. We actually have more than 6,000 shippers, more than 60 carriers, over $1.5 billion in freight transactions happening annually. Like, we have this proprietary data set in which we can service back to carriers the ability to say, this is how you're going to efficiently resolve this dispute with this SMB shipper.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this one, Joe, and I might be throwing you a softball here, but why would an LTL carrier, any one of them or all of them, really care about what we're doing and how we're going about trying to solve this on their behalf a little bit, right? Like, what do they stand to gain? And what did you see when I kind of brought you into some of those worlds when we were doing discovery? Like, why would or should they care, for any carrier that may be listening to this?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the time of volatile freight rates, given all the geopolitical things that are happening in this day and age, regional LTL carriers really need to take very specific stock of their operational efficiencies. And as it relates to finances, one of the key operational efficiencies is your days sales outstanding. If you're able to recoup cash that is already billed, you will become more efficient in your cash flow cycles. And I think that's extremely pertinent for regional, smaller LTL carriers. Now you have your transportation management system, which is in your back office. It manages maybe your freight, your ERP, your TMS. But what MyCarrier does is it synthesizes the LTL transaction with the SMB shipper, so that even for regional LTL carriers, they're able to bring on a whole host of new customer and clientele without increasing the overhead and operational costs of targeting and managing those SMB shippers. So I think it's extremely important for LTL carriers regionally to understand the benefits of the MyCarrier platform as it relates to cash flow cycles and reducing the risk and overhead of managing SMB shippers.
Now, I would imagine the way you described that, it also probably helps clean up just like what I would consider the general ledgering, right? Of like balance due and cash applied. So kind of unpack that, how the way you viewed solving this helps improve versus what they may be doing today, which should just be slapping a check in the USPS and mailing you some money.
Yeah. So as we've talked a number of times, I built my career on the concept of digital payments in various markets, right? And if you think about how fast money moves and the settlement of that money, if you're able to instantly transfer cash on a business transaction, all parties in that transaction benefit, especially the one who's receiving that money. And if you're able to have that money deposited in your bank account, have that data extracted from that, say, ACH transfer and input it into your ERP or TMS, your organization is going to become infinitely more operational savvy, efficient, and faster closing books. And then using those types of analytics to make your finance department, your operation department, all that more efficient.
Amen. I love that, because we've seen some of the carriers we've worked with be overjoyed if we can solve this and basically take a fragmented market and do a consolidated pay, which is a benefit I think 3PLs do give carriers today, is hundreds or thousands of shippers in one place, one check. And I think the way that you've kind of archetyped this and described how we're going about this in leveraging our network effect is to transfer those same perceived benefits directly to the carrier by way of digitally moving the money and the information. And I think that's great.
Yeah.
It cuts costs out, right? And if you cut costs out, you can be more competitive.
For sure. I think the efficiency around digitizing payment is maybe more realized in smaller organizations like regional LTL carriers. But even for the largest carriers out there, the ability to digitize the payment, digitize their remittance will, at the end of the day, make their cash flow all that more efficient.
Well, I can tell you it definitely will, because you kind of really called out the regional carriers and efficiencies there. But I think one of the things that's tough with national carriers, and I really hope we can get there, and as we are able to capture more of the market, right? A lot of these LTL carriers, they get portaled to death. And for you larger shippers out there, and you guys have kind of outsourced the payment of the carriers and audit to these separate companies out there that are just bespoke audit and payment companies, right? The LTL carriers have to labor a lot. And if you think about that, they've already delivered the freight. They've already waited 30 days. And whether you know it or not, you've just asked them to log into a portal with a set of credentials and submit POs they never created or whatever reference number to get paid. And it's wild, right? And so as we go up market, we're going to be able to really solve that problem, but also give the information back to the shipper and the carrier to work better together. And that to me is a win-win. So we're not going to forget about the nationals out there. Let's go out there and make some happy customers.
Definitely. Yeah, everyone's getting portaled to death. We all need to start sharing some information in a more centralized fashion so that this whole market can benefit, as opposed to these, locked gardens and making people, remember their username and password just to, complete a simple transaction.
Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll make a clunky portal to selfishly collect information and make them force them down my workflow, even though that's not what the, customers want. I love that.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and make it miserable.
Sure.
So, well, Joe, this was awesome. We got to unpack this again. I love what we're doing in this space. I want to keep this going. Payments continues to grow, and we're going to continue to drive efficiencies. So I'm stoked on that. What would you say to this? And this happened at a customer event. We'll end with this. And I do think there's some apprehension. I talked to some shippers. They saw the payment in there. They love our Invoice Hub Essentials. And one of them that they said was, I was just a little nervous to hit the button, right? So explain to me how that's actually set up and what's really happening, and that there is financial like compliance there, and that it is safe and secure, right? To really like kind of ease that, because it is unknown. A lot of them have never seen any system that has done this way.
Yeah. So look, I think the concept of a shipper being able to click a button and pay 200 carrier invoices from 4 different LTL carriers to the tune of $20,000 with their preferred payment method is something on the cutting edge for sure of this market. But I would say that we use the same exact technology, the same exact standards, the same exact compliance rules as, say, Amazon or as, say, Target. Any other e-commerce consumer transaction, we're using the exact same security, compliance, and standards that are the most important and regulated in the world, frankly. So no one has proprietary access to financial technology that isn't relevant for developers like us at MyCarrier. So the transaction is completely secure. It's been happening almost for, call it, 2 decades. So it's an extremely standardized process, and you should have no worries about submitting that. Now, what we are doing on the back end is we're reconciling all of those transactions. We're dispersing them to the carriers efficiently. So you don't have to worry about submitting those remittances. You don't have to worry about some of the communications directly with the carrier. We're handling all that for you.
Yeah. More importantly, if you're not like paying ACH or credit card today in some fashion, you don't have to worry about the gap between, oh, it's net 30, I'm going to pay on day 30, and the carrier is really getting paid on day 37 by the time they apply the cash and get it. So you are helping yourself be perceived better in the marketplace. So Joe, thanks for coming on. Thanks for making me feel safer about hitting the pay button. So it was good stuff, man.
All right. See you, Bobby. Thanks a lot.
See ya.